The world has changed, particularly in the last 30 years, the relative strength, power, and influence of the United States. We're still number one, but the gaps are closing. That's what you've seen, the rise of Asia, the rise of China, the rise of our adversaries. The Japanese have had this extraordinary presence and this a wonderful perception of what they can do in the region. They were seen as a very trusted ally and partner in ways because they were seen as a little distant from the great power, superpower competition.
So you recently were in Southeast Asia, and you've written about this in the Japan Times. President Biden recently was in Vietnam. Vice President Harris was in Jakarta for the ASEAN summit. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about getting the perspective of the Southeast Asians on how they see the United States, how they see China, the great power competition, all this sort of a thing. So can you share with us a little bit of what you learned from your trip?
Sure. It's as you can imagine, there is a fair bit of anxiety in the region. Anxiety, I think, number one, because they are aware of a smoldering competition between the United States and China. Although, more broadly speaking, it's the United States, I think, and its partners. And I think we should be careful about whether or not we just identify it as binary. But between, if you will, the US, its partners and allies, and China, to see who is going to be the predominant power in the region. There is, I think, while historically there's been some concern about US roles, and I think there's nevertheless a level of trust what overall US intentions are. So it's, if you will, the devil that you know. And there is the periodic complaints, as always, but nevertheless, I think a relationship that has largely worked for the benefit of all the countries in the region involved. China's the newcomer, and it's increasingly powerful. It has increasing economic sway. It has increasing military influence and political influence. And there's discomfort in the region about how this competition plays out, the space it provides them to engage and pursue their own particular interests, and whether or not they risk becoming proxies in this larger conflict. And by and large, they're trying to create space, and it's understandable, their reaction. But for the most part, they're welcome to see the more countries, the better in the region engaging, because it gives them more opportunities, if you will, to navigate and negotiate among them. But there is, I think, concern that as the competition between Washington and Beijing intensifies, that somehow or other they'll be caught in the middle and perhaps forced to take sides.
Caught in the middle. And in the sense of, are they concerned about a rising China economically, militarily? Are they looking at the US-China competition as a multi-frontal type conflict? How would you say is...
Well, the key, and I think, is this growing bifurcation, if you will, between economic and security interests. The United States has historically played both roles, or the US or its partners, because we certainly know during the 80s and the 90s that Japan was a huge economic presence. But over time, the United States has, for a variety of reasons, become less engaged economically, and China has grown. It's become the number one trade and investment partner for many of these countries, and thus has a relationship that these countries that are focused still on development and modernization don't want to jeopardize. And they're concerned that they will be forced to choose between a security relationship with the United States and an economic relationship with China. And the travels that I've had in the region, not only in Malaysia last month, as I wrote about, but previously I was in Singapore, Manila, Hanoi, and Bali in last months of last year. In every one of those conversations, there's no illusions about what Chinese ambitions or Chinese goals are in the region. And yet at the same time, there's also an acknowledgement of the reality of China's geographic presence. It's a force that has to be dealt with. It cannot afford to be needlessly antagonized, especially when, if you will, the counterweight is one that is thousands of miles away, and they're by choice rather than by necessity. And so these countries are trying very hard to maintain their autonomy, their agency, as we say, but at the same time prejudicing and irritating neither power so that they can maintain good economic relations and political relations with both.
So more specifically, what would you say that they want from the United States? We just had this big multilateral summit. As I mentioned, President Biden was in Vietnam. So what are you hearing that they'd like us to do for them?
More, always do more. They'd like us to be more politically engaged. They'd like us to be more economically engaged. They want to see us investing in the region and trading in the region. They like our security presence, but they also want us to be a little more restrained. They don't want us in they don't want us to be a force of destabilization. They want us to be a force of order, of calm, of quiet confidence that projects and protects a regional order of rules that ostensibly are designed to protect all and not just the rule by force, and big nations get to do more than small nations do. And they want us to do that, but without being destabilizing. They want us to find a modus vivendi to work with China so that, quite frankly, they can have the best of both worlds.
So let's bring Japan into this conversation a little bit. You wrote in your Japan Times piece about how the region has a very favorable view of the Japanese. Where do you think that the United States and Japan can have different roles, perhaps, or working similarly to try to promote our relationships with the Southeast Asian region?
Well, without question, the advantage that the United States has here with Japan, with so many different countries in so many different regions, is precisely our ability to work with allies and partners in ways that advance not only our interests, the allies' interests, but those of the people and the countries that we work with. The problem really, in so many ways, is that we've got to become better at it, that the world has changed, particularly in the last 30 years, the relative strength, power, and influence of the United States. We're still number one, but the gaps are closing. And I would argue that it is precisely the shrinking of the differences that's proof of how successful our vision of the world has been, right? That it is precisely because we've been so willing to bind ourselves and share the wealth and create rules that benefit everybody, that's what you've seen, the rise of Asia, the rise of China, the rise of our adversaries. And so, sorry, it's a long-winded answer or introduction, but what we should be doing is trying to figure out how to work more effectively with our partners precisely to come up with the division of labor. The Japanese have had this extraordinary presence and this a wonderful perception of what they can do in the region. They were seen as a very trusted ally and partner in ways because they were seen as a little distant from the great power, superpower competition by virtue of Article 9 and by virtue of the war legacy. And so they did more on economic engagement. They did more on diplomacy. And I think the United States, of course, stepped up on the military realm. And we need to be thinking more creatively and constructively about how we work precisely with Japan to come up with a more credible and a balance of power that's more efficient, more economical, that serves our interests better and well, and which we can bring other partners, South Korea, Australia, even our European allies in to help, again, advance the interests that we all see as helping each other.
Well, let's bring those other countries in just a moment. But first, let me ask you about you mentioned the perception of our policies as distinct from our policies themselves. So do you think the United States is doing a good job of telling its story?
No. That's the easy one. The question, I thought you were going to ask me a harder one, but very simple, no. And I think it's because we have assumed throughout the Cold War era and since then that we're the good guys, that our story is self-evident, our virtues are clear to all, and that all it takes is for us to sort of stand up and people will recognize the value and virtue of rallying behind us, coming together with us. And unfortunately, again, as the world has changed and we're finding that there are other countries that can provide things that are of use and are of value to these other countries and and they certainly don't have the historical baggage that we do. So we've got to rethink the way that we, and truthfully, people like you, because that's your job, man, is telling the United States story and doing more affirmatively in all our forms of engagement in ways that better tell and present a narrative of why our ideas, our values, why they're better. I mean, it's kind of crude, but that's pretty much what it has to boil down to.
Well, our ideals, our values, those have been consistent for a long time.
Yes.
But at the end of the Cold War, you heard a lot about the appeal of American blue jeans and McDonald's and that sort of a thing. Today, probably more on the lines of technology and Apple and these large companies. But the Chinese are increasingly playing in that space too. And I know that you're working on a book, I think, on the growing technological competition between the United States and China.
Absolutely, and thanks for the plug. Let me break your question down though into three little parts. I think the first piece of this is what you were alluding to, blue jeans, et cetera. And I think what we're talking about in that case is what is often called soft power, which is the allure, the ability of us or a country to rally others behind it by the power of its ideas, to get them willingly, as opposed to coercively, to back and support our products and our projects. And I think that the United States historically, and to this day, still has the ability to rally other countries and behind our soft power. Mind you, it has been under assault. And frankly, the American exceptionalism, the American democracy, so much of that has been compromised and I'm afraid damaged, very much damaged in the last few years. And we have to rebuild that brand and rebuild the power of those ideas. But a second piece of it is literally the ability of other countries, whether it's the United States or Japan or China, to materially improve the lives of the citizens of these other countries. And what is that? That's putting money on the table. That is the concrete deliverable that raises the level of living, that is trade, that is money in their pockets, that is ports, that is infrastructure. And the truth of the matter is we have been falling off on that. And we certainly understand, we talk about the Build Back Better World initiative. We talked about the Partnership for Global Infrastructure initiative. We understand that we need to be addressing these problems and putting money on the table, making concrete gestures rather than ideas. But we're a long way away from delivering on that. The third piece of this, which is the one I'm most excited about and the one which will be our next program, is about this high-tech competition and the ability of the United States and its allies and partners to be able to deliver and build the 21st century, the economies and the societies that are so deeply, deeply reliant upon new and emerging technologies. And it's my belief that the countries that are the leaders in those domains in the coming decades will be the countries that either rewrite the rules of global order or support the rules that exist. And so our ability to master these new technologies, AI, biotech, adaptive printing, what some call 3D printing, quantum, etc. It is precisely your mastery of those technologies and then your ability to disseminate them through your countries, through your societies in ways that allow people to live better lives, if you will. And we're talking about the challenges of smart societies, of aging societies, of green and digital transformations. All of this is part of that, and they all fit together. Those are the countries that will be leading the world. And it is precisely the ability to put that technology together with our values that will determine who is how the world works in the 21st century.
Well, so this issue of putting money on the table and this issue of encouraging technological innovation as countries gets down to different actors. So you've got government and you've got business. So when you look at U.S. investment in Southeast Asia, for example, compared to the Chinese have, by nature of their system, an opportunity to talk about all the investment that their governments make. Our investments coming more from the private sector and facilitating that.
Absolutely.
So first question is, what do you think, how that impacts our ability to tell our story? In my view, it makes it a lot more challenging to tell a story when it's private sector led investments. The U.S. government can't clearly point to that in the same way that the Chinese government can, as saying, this is what we, the government, are bringing for you in Southeast Asia.
Absolutely correct. There's no doubt that we have lived in a world that has drawn sharp lines between public and private sectors and have made it, I think, very difficult then for them to come together, even when they are working in pursuit of common interests. And at the end of the day, yes, there is some truth to what's good for General Motors is good for America, but also what's good for America is good for General Motors. We've reached, for years, globalization has promoted companies that are spread all over the world and have less of an identification, if you will, with a particular home country. In truth, that isn't always the case. But nevertheless, I think there is more to it than just the physical boundaries of a country that matter a great deal here. And I think we need to look at, again, the larger consequences of the competition and all of the factors that are at work here. And I think we need to, as you said exactly, be looking more at this holistic view of engagement and understanding the way that our futures are intertwined, which is very much one of the challenges, I think, of the 21st century, whether we're talking about climate change in particular, but all of the associated problems and even others, pandemic health, et cetera. We need to be understanding that the public and private sectors are far, far more integrated, I think, than we have historically believed. And the truth of the dirty secret of American economy for the last 50 years is that the myth of the, the entrepreneur and the capitalist working away in a garage and completely, if you will, an antagonist of the government is not true. Some of the greatest accomplishments in the U.S. economy during the Cold War were very much a function of assistance in what we would call industrial policy. But we have myths, and we have to overcome these myths. And I think in thinking about how we tell our story better, more realistically, I think we'll also be coming up with ways to rethink the myths and to come to a better understanding of how we got to where we are, and equally important, how to improve our lives and the lives of others going forward.
Absolutely. So one last question, if I may.
Always.
Now you led in at the beginning talking about how it's not just U.S. and China. The U.S. has partners and allies, and absolutely, I think that's correct. Let's talk about the role of some of the other countries that, as it affects back to Southeast Asia. So we have India, we have Australia that are also members of the Quad. What sort of role do you see these countries playing as a partner and in one case ally of the United States?
Well, I think there's three we should probably talk about. You left South Korea out, and I know South Korea is of great interest to you. So let me work my way up. I think from the shorter answers to the small ones. We'll start with the Australians, and the Australians have long been one of our closest allies in the region. They are at an interesting place geographically in the sense that they are truly alert to the strategic significance of the Indian Ocean by virtue of having a coastline on the Indian Ocean, unlike Japan, unlike the United States. And so I think they understand, literally the sweep of and the meaning of Southeast Asia at the confluence of two seas. Literally, that's where they are. They also have this geographic presence which extends them influence into the South Pacific. We need to be working more, and we are working more with Australia. And the Australians are coming to understand, I think, an intensifying geopolitical competition and recognizing that the more they do, weirdly enough, it helps create stability rather than instability by presenting, if you will, a united front and showing that there are a larger array of forces that are committed to peace and the status quo in the Indo-Pacific region. So Australia is a vital partner, and of course, in our relationship with AUKUS and as part of the Quad, they're showing that they have a great deal to contribute in new ways that we probably haven't thought of until recently. So that would be Australia. And then India. And India, of course, is just the second largest country in the world. It has historically been the dominant power in South Asia. It has this huge geographic presence. It is a nuclear power. It is a country, however, that has something of a fraught relationship with the United States. And interestingly enough, to my mind, our partnership with India is growing bilaterally. Our partnership with them in the Quad is really important in terms of the provision of public goods generally. Not the military piece. I think the military piece of the Quad is overstated. The natural partnership within the Quad, including India, I think is between Delhi and Tokyo. And so I think that's a fascinating axis, and one that we need to study more. And I think that the Japanese, Prime Minister Abe, Prime Minister Kishida, have been very good at promoting and pursuing and recognizing the opportunities there and pursuing them. And they've had a partner in Prime Minister Modi, and that's an important development. And hopefully we will find that some of the more, perhaps what seem to be the more nationalist impulses will be attenuated or slowed a little bit. But nevertheless, both, I think, Kishida and Modi recognize as well the real need to speak out and to speak to and for the rest of the developing world. Few leaders, I think, and perhaps the only other one that would match them is Xi Jinping in China, have been as assiduous in courting, in understanding the role that we play and the need, again, to tell the story and to create a larger consensus in the international system in support of either revision or support for the order that we've got. And so I think they're both doing really important work. The third, of course, is South Korea, which is, you and I have talked a lot about over the past. And South Korea, at this moment, is an extraordinary opportunity with President Yoon. We've seen that with the Camp David summit, with the trilateral cooperation agreements that are going forward. There's a sensitivity and an understanding in Seoul right now that it has the ability to do, I think, historically important things and to change the framework. The problem, of course, is that we've heard this before. And the trick is going to be whether or not Yoon can both somehow insulate the accomplishments that he makes from political pressures and from the potential change of government in 4 years, 27 when I believe he's up for election next. But equally important is that he can maintain the focus in Seoul on a global presence and not, as is so many times in the past, speak globally or regionally about bigger vision and then continually be restricted to Korean Peninsula affairs. North Korea has a tendency to pull South Korean governments back. So if we can, if South Korea can maintain that openness, maintain that sense of activism, of agency, of engagement, and I think it will find that it has a partner both in Washington and, I think, fascinating here in Tokyo as well. And those are the opportunities that we need to be seizing in the United States, working with these partners, working with these allies in ways that advance, again, all of our interests. But as I said earlier, and I'm sorry to go on so long, but I think the key question becomes, how is it that we engage in new and creative ways? Because our old way of doing stuff is I think its time has run out. That string has run. And it's time to think differently about how we engage and how we work in and of this world.
That's fantastic. Well, we're out of time.
No!
But thanks so much for joining us. We'll have to have you back to continue the conversation.
Always happy to see you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Brett.